Welcome. Today we're doing a deep dive into some really quite provocative source material.
Definitely provocative.
Yeah, it looks at this argument that the Democratic Party has shifted sharply left, maybe even, and this is the controversial part, putting the U.S. on a path similar to Venezuela's economic troubles.
And alongside that, it lays out a specific conservative plan linked to a potential Trump return aimed at, well, the text calls it restoring the republic.
Right, it's a really bold claim. Our mission here isn't to agree or disagree, but to unpack the arguments, look at the evidence presented in the sources, and understand the proposed solutions. We want you, the listener, to get a clear picture of this whole analysis.
So the starting point in the text is really establishing this idea of a big shift in the Democratic Party. It argues the party today, in 2025, is just fundamentally different from, say, the Democrats of the 1990s.
The Clinton era, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text contrasts current trends pretty sharply with Clinton's policies, things like welfare reform that focus on balancing the budget. It feels like a different world, according to this analysis.
And who does the text credit or maybe blame, depending on your view, for this shift?
Well, it highlights figures like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren. It sees them as, key drivers pushing the party in a more progressive direction.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. What evidence does the text use for this leftward shift?
It points to things like polling data, like a 2024 Pew Research survey showing more Democrats supporting ideas like universal basic income or UBI, single-payer health care, student loan forgiveness.
Things that were definitely more on the fringes maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Absolutely. And then there's the Green New Deal. That gets a lot of focus.
Ah, yes, the Green New Deal. The text mentions the cost estimate too, doesn't it?
It does. It cites a 2019 study from the American Action Forum, I think, estimating it at $93 trillion over 10 years. That's presented as sort of exhibit A of this really ambitious, expensive, progressive agenda.
93 trillion. Wow. And this is built on earlier expansions of government too, right? The text mentions healthcare.
Yeah, it brings up the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, under Obama as a landmark expansion of government and healthcare.
Okay.
And then thinking back to the 2020 Democratic primaries, you had proposals like Medicare for all.
That was huge. The cost estimate cited was around $32 trillion over 10 years from the Mercatus Center.
That's the one. And free college tuition was another big one, maybe $600 billion a year.
Yeah.
So the scale of proposed government involvement was really growing.
Even if the 2024 platform under Harris was seen as maybe a bit more moderate.
Right. The text acknowledges that, but still argues it endorsed significant climate rules, wealth taxes, expanded social programs.
Mm-hmm.
The underlying trend, according to the source, was still there.
So the analysis seems to group these policies. What are the main categories?
The first one they focus on is economic redistribution.
Okay, like taxes.
Exactly. It cites things like AOC suggesting that 70% top marginal tax rate back in 2019, or Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax idea from 2020.
And the text connects this to potential negative outcomes.
It does. It raises concerns about, dampening innovation or investment. It even mentions a CBO projection, Congressional Budget Office, suggesting maybe a 0.5% drop in annual GDP.
And that's where the Venezuela comparison starts to creep in.
Yes, subtly at first. It draws a parallel to how Venezuela taxed its oil sector historically, implying similar risks.
Interesting. Okay, what's the second category?
Government spending, that's a big one.
Predictably.
Yeah. The $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan gets mentioned, obviously, and the overall national debt figure.
Which is?
Currently around $35 trillion. That's, 103% of GDP. And the CBO projects it could hit $50 trillion by 2035.
Again, a huge number.
And again, the text explicitly links this to Venezuela's history, framing it as potentially similar debt-fueled spending that caused problems there.
Okay, so redistribution spending. What else?
Regulation and even nationalization come next.
Regulation like in the Green New Deal.
Exactly. It's regulatory side. But it also points to a specific proposal from Senator Markey in 2023 suggesting nationalizing parts of the fossil fuel industry.
Wow. Okay. That's a strong step.
And that's where the Venezuela comparison becomes really direct. The text cites Venezuela nationalizing its oil in 2007 and the collapse in production that followed, a 60% drop.
A very pointed comparison.
Very. The last category is social programs, things like universal health care, free college.
Which are popular ideas, right?
Yeah.
The text mentions Gallup polls showing support.
It does acknowledge the public support.
Right.
But then immediately It contrasts it with Venezuela's healthcare system, saying it was initially praised but ultimately collapsed.
So that's the pattern. Propose a policy, then show a negative Venezuelan outcome.
Exactly. That's the core rhetorical structure for this part of the argument. And it seems to tap into existing anxieties.
How so?
Well, it cites a 2024 Rasmussen poll finding that almost half, 48% of Americans, actually worry the U.S. could face a decline similar to Venezuela's.
Okay, so let's dig into that comparison itself. What picture does the text paint of Venezuela's collapse?
A pretty grim one. It talks about the oil nationalization leading to just catastrophic drops in production, 70% by 2020, and exports falling off a cliff, like 95%.
And the human cost?
Severe shortages. Food, medicine, basics. It cites a UN estimate that by 2019, 80% of people there were facing hunger. Just devastating.
What about the economic mechanics behind it?
The text explains Chavez funded social programs heavily with oil money. When prices fell, the deficits ballooned. Debt to GDP hit 70% by 2014.
And then hyperinflation.
Unbelievable hyperinflation. The example given is a loaf of bread costing $1 million bolivars by 2018. It also mentions price controls backfiring, creating black markets.
And a poor business environment generally.
Yeah, it points to Venezuela's ranking in the Heritage Economic Freedom Index, 274th in 2024. Issues with rule of law, property rights, all that.
It wasn't just economic, though, was it? The text mentions freedoms, too.
Right. Erosion of democratic freedoms is a key part of the narrative, suppressing the press, jailing opposition figures, claims of rigged elections.
Leading to mass immigration.
Exactly. 7 million people leaving by 2024, according to the UNHCR. A huge diaspora.
So having painted that picture, how does the text then explicitly link this back to the U.S. today? It acknowledges the situations aren't identical, right?
Yes, it does say the U.S. isn't Venezuela, but it flags what it calls economic warning signs.
That's
The growing national debt, primarily. That $35 trillion figure, the fact it's rising by $2 trillion a year, and the projected interest payments, $1 trillion just on interest by 2030, according to the CBO.
and inflation concerns.
Yes. It links recent inflation partly to quantitative easing by the Fed and big stimulus packages like the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. It cites a 2024 Gallup poll where 60% of Americans are worried about prices.
Okay, so debt and inflation are the main economic parallels drawn. What else?
Government overreach is another theme. It mentions the climate parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, citing criticism from the Cato Institute. Also the plan to expand the IRS, although that was scaled back.
Right.
Then it looks at social programs and inequality. The cost of student loan forgiveness, CBO put it at $400 billion. Expanded welfare, the percentage of people getting government aid.
Which the text says is increasing.
Yeah, citing Brookings figures, around 47% in 2024. It also compares inequality levels using the Gini coefficient, noting Venezuela's was higher, but implying the U.S. trend is worrying.
And finally, political division.
Polarization, yeah. It mentions a 2024 YouGov poll, 55% of Americans seeing the other party as a threat to democracy. That's presented as echoing the kind of toxic politics seen in Venezuela before its crisis deepened.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the next part. The claimed negative consequences of these democratic policies viewed through this critical lens. How does the text break those down?
Into three main areas of concern: economic stability, individual freedoms, and social cohesion.
Let's start with economic stability.
Here, the text points to the Biden administration spending $6 trillion in new spending from 2021 to 2024 and the persistent annual deficit, around $1.8 trillion, according to the CBO.
And the argument is the spending is harmful.
Yes, citing economists like Thomas Sowell who argue it crowds out private investment. It also mentions a Heritage Foundation study predicting a 1% annual GDP reduction by 2030 if these trends continue.
What about taxes again?
Concerns about wealth taxes are raised, using France's experience as a negative example. High corporate taxes, too, citing a tax foundation estimate they could cut job creation by nearly 1%.
And the Green New Deal cost comes up again.
Yes, this time citing a McKinsey estimate of $15 trillion. The text links potential energy cost increases from climate policies to things like coal plant closures, again drawing a parallel to Venezuela's energy mismanagement.
So a strong focus on potential economic downsides. What about the second area, individual freedoms?
This section voices concerns about potential gun control measures, citing high Democrat support in polls. Also worries about speech regulations, government surveillance.
Is there data cited on surveillance concerns?
Yeah, a 2023 Cato Institute survey where 58% expressed worry about government surveillance. It also notes the U.S. dropping in the Heritage Economic Freedom Index rankings from 6th in 2000 down to 25th in 2024.
And the cost of regulation.
That's mentioned too. An estimate from the Competitive Enterprise Institute putting the annual cost of federal regulations at around $2 trillion.
Okay, economics, freedoms. The third concern was social cohesion.
Right, social cohesion and division. Here the text circles back to the share of Americans getting government aid, citing Brookings again. The argument presented is that this might foster dependency or entitlement.
What else falls under social cohesion?
The impact of DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion. It mentions a Pew survey where 55% of Republicans felt silenced. Also, the impact of inflation on the wealth gap. The Fed data showing the top 1% holding 32% of wealth in 2024, and stagnant real wages for the bottom half. The implication is these trends fuel division.
This is a pretty comprehensive critique laid out in the source material.
It is. It paints a picture of significant risks associated with the current trajectory, as the text sees it.
Which then logically leads into the proposed alternative, the conservative plan under Trump. How is that presented?
As a three-pillar strategy: economic revitalization, protecting liberty, and social renewal.
Okay, pillar one, economic revitalization. What does that involve?
Fiscal restraint is key. There's talk of cutting $2 trillion in spending annually, targeting things like ACA subsidies, climate grants. The goal mentioned is balancing the budget by 2035.
Ambitious.
Very. It also includes tax reform, Trump's America First plan, lowering the corporate rate to 15%, extending individual cuts. Deregulation is another major piece, a 10-out, 1-in rule for regulations.
Building on his first term's approach.
Exactly. And there's a focus on trade and manufacturing, tariffs on imports, especially from China, maybe 10–20%, and a big Made in America initiative, $500 billion, which heritage projects could create 500,000 jobs.
Any specific examples given?
The text mentions a steel plant reopening in Ohio as the kind of outcome hoped for.
Okay, that's the economic pillar. What about pillar two, protecting individual liberties?
This covers several areas. First, Second Amendment rights plans to veto gun control, citing the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. Support for national concealed carry reciprocity.
What about free speech?
An executive order targeting text censorship is proposed. Also, DOJ investigations into what the text calls woke policies. Federalism is another point promoting state and local control, citing the 10th Amendment.
And judicial appointments?
Yes, a big focus on continuing to appoint conservative judges, aiming for a 7–2 conservative majority on the Supreme Court by 2029. Florida banning DEI mandates in schools is given as a state-level example of this direction.
All right. Pillar three, social and cultural renewal. What's covered here?
Education reform is prominent. A $20 billion school choice program, like Betsy DeVos advocated for. Cutting federal funds for curricula tied to CRT or gender ideology, citing parental concerns.
Immigration seems likely to be in there too.
Absolutely. Expanding the border wall, $5 billion estimated cost. Ramping up deportations, an ICE estimate of $10 million by 2028 is mentioned, and shifting to a merit-based visa system.
What about family and faith?
Proposals like a $5,000 per child tax credit associated with Senator Vance, more funding for faith-based initiatives, and even media and culture initiatives, a patriotic media fund, and American heritage festivals are mentioned.
So it's a very broad agenda. Does the text give a sense of how this would be implemented, a timeline?
It does suggest a fast start, a blitz of executive actions in 2025 to bypass Congress where possible. And it sets out milestones for the following years. Tax cuts passed by 2026, deregulation targets hit, progress on border security, school choice expansion, judicial appointments, aiming for specific GDP growth and unemployment numbers, deportation targets, energy independence, debt reduction. Quite detailed.
It sounds like a very comprehensive and very ambitious counterproposal.
That's certainly how it's presented in the source material, a complete reversal of the trends it critiques.
Right. Okay, so after laying all this out, the critique, the comparison, the plan, how does the text finally handle the Venezuela comparison itself? Does it double down or offer nuance?
It does offer some nuance right at the end. It asks, is this comparison realistic or just alarmist?
And the answer?
It acknowledges the U.S. has strengths Venezuela lacked. A diversified economy, independent courts, free elections tradition, lower inflation currently, stable institutions like the Fed. It even cites a Brookings study saying the U.S. is nowhere near Venezuela's kind of collapse.
But there's usually a but.
There is. The counter-argument presented is that complacency is dangerous, that a slow decline is possible, driven by debt, regulation, cultural division, even if it's not a sudden collapse like Venezuela.
So a warning against assuming it can't happen here.
Precisely. It mentions a Manhattan Institute report warning about a potential U.S. debt crisis by 2040 as evidence that serious risks do exist down the road.
So wrapping this all up, the source material we've dug into today really presents a stark choice, doesn't it? A critical view of the current path, drawing these dramatic, concerning parallels with Venezuela.
And contrasting it with a very defined conservative blueprint for change, touching almost every aspect of policy and society.
Our goal in this deep dive was simply to lay out those arguments, the evidence used in the text, to support them, both the critique and the proposed plan.
We've looked at the asserted leftward shift, the warnings drawn from Venezuela's experience, and the details of that conservative counter-agenda focused on economics, liberty, and culture.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, the parallels drawn, but also the significant differences between the U.S. and Venezuela highlighted in the analysis, what single factor do you think will be most decisive for America's economic and social stability going forward?
It's a complex question with no easy answer.
Definitely. We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, thinking critically, and forming your own informed perspective.